I'll do some quick introductions. On my left here is Professor Liz Bentley, who's the Chief Executive of the Royal Meteorological Society. Next to her is Dr. Nicola Eckersley-Waites, Head of Innovation at the CBI. To her left is Sarah Honour, Head of Climate Science at BEIS. And finally, at the far left is Professor Sir Duncan Wingham, Executive Chair of NERC. So we're going to kick off with 8 minutes of each speaker giving us an introduction, starting with you, Liz.
Yeah, so obviously this is a Science Council climate conference, and Science Council is made up of different member bodies, learned societies, professional bodies across the science community. And so I guess my focus in my 8 minutes is really around the importance of those bodies and the importance of the role of Science Council in helping to drive forward science and technology in the UK. So I'm going to focus on 4 things. The first is science itself, and I think if you've been listening to the plenaries and involved in the sessions today, you'll know that science has come out front and centre, both in our understanding of the problem we have with our climate change, but also the solutions as well, whether that's mitigation and adaptation. So science is front and centre, and obviously the importance, I think, of the Science Council and the various member bodies in helping to drive that. Linked with that, we have the science-based targets. And again, we've had discussions as we've gone through today about the importance of science-based targets and the importance of roadmaps in order to get us to net zero. So again, just another recognition of the importance of the science. The second area I wanted to talk about was the role of professional bodies. So each of the members of Science Council support their professions in different ways. Some of them are commonality. Whether those people are scientists, whether they're technicians, whether they're consultants, whether they're involved in the core science or the solutions to make change. And it's really important that we support those people working in the profession and the role of professional bodies that do that important role. And so just thinking about things that we do as professional bodies, Science Council itself oversees the registered and chartered scientists, and that has various bodies have licenses to oversee that. But there are also other bodies like ourselves at the RMetS Society that have accreditation schemes to support the profession, such as chartered meteorologists in our case. And it's really important that we support people through their career, but also drive the next generation of people coming into this field as well. The third area I wanted to focus on was the importance of education and engagement. So many of the societies that make up Science Council are also charities, and a key part of their charitable activity is the important work that we do around education and engagement. So again, working with schools, working with teachers involved in curriculum to make sure that the next generation have the information to be able to be engaged in that conversation around climate change, and also for kind of green jobs of the future as well, so they're skilled to take on those roles. So education is really important, whether that's involved in, as I say, the curriculum view to make sure that these important topics appear on the curriculum, whether that's involved in the resources that we deliver to schools and to teachers to bring these topics to life in the classroom. Really important role. And then we've got science engagement. So this is about wider, I guess, informal education with much wider audiences than just at school, so through to the general public, and how we can educate people, give them the information, and effectively empower them to make decisions, to make change. And that's a really important role, again, for many of the societies that make up the members of Science Council. Training as well, I think, comes obviously in a formal education route, but also an informal education route. So how do we provide CPD and formal training to those individuals that need those different skills, those new skills, but also training to provide communicators. So we've got a team of informed people who are confident to talk about this topic to a much wider audience as well. And again, many of the learned societies that make up Science Council get involved in these activities. The final area I wanted to touch on was leadership, and I think every member of Science Council and Science Council itself has a role in leadership. So, we have the knowledge, we have the skills, we have the expertise, but it's important that we lead by example. So, you know, we have the words, but we also take the actions to make these changes. And I think that's a really important role for many people, I guess, in this audience who are involved in climate change and climate science, that we take on that leadership role as well. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Nicola.
Hi, yeah, so hi, I'm Nicola, I'm Head of Innovation at the CBI. So those who don't know CBI, it's the Confederation of British Industry. So we represent businesses from across all sectors and of all sizes of the economy. So in total, that's around 190,000 businesses that we represent. So you might be thinking we don't necessarily sound like a core member of the science and engineering community and wonder why we're here. We certainly do have members who are in that very R&D intensive science heavy space, but an awful lot of our members aren't. They wouldn't consider themselves sort of science-based companies. But I think when it comes to net zero and decarbonisation, actually it's an area where all of those businesses across that entire sort of sectoral range need to be thinking about how they work with the science and engineering community and upskill themselves. So I was just going to touch very briefly on how CBI thinks about climate and decarbonisation, and then talk a little bit about some work we've been doing called Be More Green, that's been about encouraging our members to think about how they innovate for decarbonisation and what that looks like for them. So just very briefly, as CBI, we launched a new strategy last year called Seize the Moment, which set out kind of 6 pillars of what we think a thriving, growing economy of 2030 looks like. And decarbonisation is one of those 6 areas. And that's an area we're really committed to, regardless of political environment, but I think hopefully that isn't going to change. And that's for several reasons, both this audience needs to be convincing. We're convinced that there is a scientific and societal imperative for businesses and the economy to be decarbonising rapidly. But beyond that, obviously, as CBI, we care a lot about economic growth and the economic prizes for the UK. And we believe strongly that actually, you know, the economic opportunity in decarbonisation for the UK is huge. So in that strategy, we set out that we estimated that moving towards kind of the UK's net zero targets by 2030, well, not net zero, targets towards on that pathway by 2030 would generate 240,000 net new jobs in the UK, and that there were potential export economic prizes of looking at EU exports alone of around £18 billion worth of exports in electric vehicles and batteries to the EU, and £3 billion worth of exports in the wind energy generation sector, just as a couple of examples. So this is an area where we think there's both societal but also economic sort of imperative to be driving change from the business perspective. But I think we were very aware, so I sit within our innovation team, not within our decarbonisation team, but very aware that actually that's not easy for businesses. Even R&D intensive, science intensive businesses, they don't necessarily have the skills in this area to know how to do that. So we launched a campaign which Charlotte, my colleague in the audience, has been running. You can talk more to her later about it. She'd love to talk about it. It's called Be More Green. That was really looking at, well, how can we help businesses of all sizes and wherever they are on that, thinking about that journey, whether that's getting started or a bit further along, be making changes to start thinking about innovating, whether in their products, their processes, and for many businesses, even their whole way of operating their business model that will need to change for them to really decarbonise. So we looked at a number of case studies, spoke to businesses across a huge range of sectors, talking about what they're doing and how they're doing it. And I think one thing that came out that I really wanted to talk about today in this context is that partnership with the science and engineering community. As I said, most of the businesses just don't have the skills internally, particularly the expertise in this area for anything along that pathway, from knowing and understanding their emissions and where their biggest impact on the environment is, through to understanding what innovations are out there that they could just adopt in a sort of tried and tested way, developing new innovations where they need to, and kind of reporting and measuring that impact. And I think throughout the entire pathway, partnership came across as a really important part that businesses need in order to be able to do this. Partnerships with academia, with innovative startups, with their supply chain. And I was just going to highlight a couple of them on a kind of individual level, and then think maybe taking a step back about what that broader partnership across the sector looks like. A couple of really nice examples we heard, and just to illustrate the sort of diversity, I guess, of those partnerships. We spoke to Tata Steel, who you can imagine quite a carbon intensive business. At one of their sites in Wales, they actually had done the calculations and realised that one of their biggest emission areas came from their steel coat sort of coatings, their paints. And actually, if they could decarbonise the solvent paint part of their business, that would reduce their carbon emissions from that site by 70%. So they've got a sort of traditional academic partnership with Swansea University. They sponsor PhD students there who sort of bring a talent pipeline into the business. They also access facilities where they can test out new products at the university. And similarly, the university has the opportunity to test things out at scale within that business. Another example was an SME we spoke to called OnGen, who their business model is actually in the kind of decarbonisation space. They're a digital services model where they have digital tools for businesses to look at how they can decarbonise their own business. But they developed that software in partnership with academics at Edinburgh, Napier and Heriot-Watt University. And again, found that partnership with engineers really helped them develop something which was then having impact further down the supply chain. And the other example I wanted to give was, because it's a business at the complete opposite end of the kind of science intensive spectrum, was Compass Group, who are a huge food service, global food service company. We don't tend to think of them doing much science for innovation. They provide catering services, but they've been partnering with the LEAP programme at Oxford University, testing out the impact of low carbon labelling on behavioural choices and seeing whether that was an effective way that they could look at decarbonising their operations. So I think those are really exciting on an individual business level of how partnership with the science and engineering community is helping businesses make real world impact in what they're doing. I think that they're obviously at an individual business level, and a couple of just points that came out of that work that I wanted to highlight at the kind of more community level and think about what we as institutions can do. One of them was the role that businesses can play in their supply chain. So businesses, obviously almost all large businesses have a huge supply chain that goes down to very many SMEs and a huge range of sectors. And I think the opportunity for impact beyond a single business when they take action is huge. So, for example, we spoke to Costain, an engineering service construction company. They run a supply chain academy that's focused on how they can be encouraging their supply chain to be more productive, to be focused more on growth and innovation. And as part of that, they are upskilling their supply chain on sustainability and sustainable approaches to their work. So I think it's an interesting way that actually collaboration with Costain is seen as one individual business. Actually, the impact of that could be much broader by looking at how you spread that throughout the system. And I think the other one was just touching on actually that Sir Patrick he made the point around systems and systems thinking. I think when we spoke to businesses, we had a roundtable where we brought them together to talk about the issues that they faced in innovating for sustainability. One of them was the strong realization that they are one part of a complex system. They're very aware that they don't want to do something in their business which they think is positive but actually has unintended consequences. And I think helping businesses and other stakeholders think through how do they do this effectively? How can we convene people to work together and tackle it as a systems challenge is a role that probably we can play in this room.
Excellent, thank you. As CEO of Institution of Environmental Sciences, I'm always happy to hear systems when you talk about. Sarah.
Thank you. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about how we use science in government to help support policy. And that's an enormous topic. I mean, and so I can't even seek to do justice to it. But I mean, the key point is that science is critical. It has been all along in identifying the issues around climate change, in continuing to diagnose what it means for the environment and for people and systems, and then in actually coming up with solutions and things like that. And I think, you know, a key exemplar of that is the fact that my role exists and I have a team of scientists, and there is also a team of engineers that sits within BEIS and actually provides advice to government and works with the wider community to actually generate that advice. But I thought I'd pick on a couple of key areas where actually I think science and engineering is very important to current and future policy development. The first one is net zero itself and what it actually means to achieve it, I guess. In its sort of most narrow sense, net zero is actually just a balance between emissions and removals. And what's actually really important is that pathway to net zero and the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted along that pathway, because that actually determines the temperature and the level of warming that we actually end up with. And actually communicating that point and using it very effectively to demonstrate the importance of urgent action if we want to limit warming to well below 2 degrees and, you know, achieve 1.5, then actually the importance of reaching that net zero for the UK by 2050 and more globally soon after, it's very important. And then also some of the issues around understanding the role that different gases play in doing that and the timing of that. So these are very important issues for then sort of understanding, I guess, also what we mean when we actually reach net zero, in terms of actually not just the physical impacts that different levels of warming have, but also actually those impacts on human systems, on food, on livelihood and things like that. And I think the science is really developing very well here in terms of actually understanding not just the physical impacts, but what it means for human economic systems and things like that. Because actually we as government will make decisions around policy areas, energy systems, food systems, those kind of areas. So actually understanding the chain of impacts and what it means both internationally, both globally and also for the UK is important for that policy and those policy decisions. And as Nicola's really carefully highlighted, actually that systems approach and understanding the implications of decisions, decision making across the board is very important to make sure that the policies we implement are based on sound science and don't have unintended impacts. A second area I think is really important is understanding the potential pathways to get to net zero. So if we know what net zero looks like, we know about the impacts that it might bring, we also need to know what the best route for getting there is. And there isn't, I think, for true knowledge, and we can't wait for true knowledge to actually devise that. So we need to understand what the effective technologies are now and start implementing those and understand what they mean for delivery. I think, yes, as a key thing, I think from myself and the department is actually understanding what those mitigation measures are that we can take, but also what the co-benefits of those measures are, and also some of the barriers and difficulties there are. I think one of the areas and issues that come out as part of this is actually understanding, for example, the costs, the availability of different technologies, the feasibility, how they can be applied, and what they mean for other important areas of government policy. So, for example, the IPCC, the second assessment, the sixth assessment report, the working group 2, was very key and clear in demonstrating not just the impacts and the benefits that climate action can take, but also the co-benefits that can have with air quality, with biodiversity, and with achieving different sustainable development goals. Specifically in a UK level, we're interested in things like, okay, if we move to a hydrogen economy, what does that actually mean for the environmental impacts? And we know that hydrogen is an indirect greenhouse gas. We expect there will be significant benefits of moving from methane to hydrogen, but we need to understand the impacts of hydrogen on the environment. A third area where I think it's very important that we can work together as scientists to understand is actually our greenhouse gas emissions and tracking those emissions. How do we know we're actually making progress towards net zero? And actually, how do we know that we've actually met net zero? So my department has the UK greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And that's a very good inventory. I don't want to undermine it in the slightest. But as we move from where we are now to net zero, that inventory will face some key challenges. Some of the main emission sources, fossil fuel emission sources that we are very confident about, will hopefully go to zero or near zero. So that leaves some other areas of emissions that we have much less certainty about. So some of the diffuse emission sources, some of the fugitive emission sources from methane and things like that, land use, these are all quite complex and very uncertain areas. And so actually we need to use the next few years to really improve our understanding of those areas and think how we can drive measurements, remote sensing, other technologies to help us to understand that. We need to understand global emissions, but we also are only interested in emissions because actually they help us to understand what mitigation action we're taking and the progress we're making. We're actually interested in the impacts that we're seeing in the environment. So, global greenhouse gas concentrations are important, but also then the impacts on temperature, the impacts that we're seeing on energy budgets, on sea ice, all those kind of things. Tracking those and understanding that the implications of the policy measures we've had and the impacts they have are very important. One final thing is just to sort of say, I guess, how do we, in practice, actually use the science that's out there to support policy? We've got a couple of really important things we do. So we work internationally. We work very closely with the IPCC to understand and to drive and steer that policy process. We also work with UK authors because actually that's a really important thing. The credibility and the expertise that we as the UK have is very important for helping to steer some of those global policies and initiatives. We work very closely with research councils. The hydrogen work I was talking about, we're working with NERC on that. And we also do very specific pieces of research to do targeted understanding of specific things to support specific policy issues, for example, around land use and understanding the implications of different land use choices, whether it be for bioenergy crops, for afforestation, for peatland restoration. Understand the implications of that so we can feed that into policy is a very important activity for us. And finally, also, I have a team of scientists within the team who actually work very closely with policy teams to develop and support policy development. But there's more we can do, I'm sure. There's a lot of expertise in this room and out there, and I think we're very keen to actually continue to develop that process so that we can do that translation and can really benefit from the expertise and the understanding that's out there.
Thank you. Duncan. Yeah, thank you. I guess my feeling was that in some audiences, I guess I would have to speak first to try and convince people that science and innovation actually mattered, I suppose, and in particularly that's particularly relevant now because all the deck chairs are being rearranged in Whitehall as we speak. But I think that this audience, I don't need to make that case. I guess the fact that you're here means that actually you're convinced. And that I thought that maybe what might be more useful actually is to say what we are actually intending to do about UKI under this heading, broadly speaking, of the environment. So just real quickly, as some of you may know, I've been around a long time in this role and certainly been around long enough to go through the transition from the old separated research councils to the arrangements under UKI we have now. And I in coming into UKI, there was a sort of occasion to think about the role of NERC actually, but in that broader context. And I think thinking about that, the way that I sort of try and sometimes rapidly crystallize that is that if I apply to the Environmental Council the challenge of being like a medical research council, you immediately see that a medical research council does prevention, diagnosis and cure. And if you look at environmental science in this country, it does some things on prevention. It does a lot very well on diagnosis. In other words, how we're wrecking the joint, but it doesn't do anything at all on cure. And that's generally true internationally. So environmental scientists, and I've seen them do it actually, end their thinking with "over to you, Minister," and I've seen that happen live. Once you though go across to this question of cure, what you immediately recognize is that actually what you need is a whole different skill set. And indeed, diagnosis, once the job's done, tends to fade away actually in some respects. But what is obvious is that to deal with the challenges of solving the problems of the environment, we have to think multidisciplinarily. I don't mean that all disciplines are relevant to all problems. It's a silly statement, although you sometimes hear it. But I do mean that most problems require more than one, and some require several. And for me, UKI, at least in theory at the time, back in 2018 or whenever it was, in principle offered a way of trying to grapple with that problem. And as we have now just had a reasonably lengthy spending review rather than a succession of one-year ones, it's quite nice actually. I've been making this case that we need an environmental activity at UKI for quite a long time. It's quite nice to say that we now have one. Actually, I could even say I have one in the sense that I now have a wallet with some change in it. And this is just a recognition really of the relevance, the ever increasing relevance of the environment in every aspect of what we do. Now, that's the sort of easy bit of the story, but immediately one needs to then sort of ask questions like, and in particular, first, scope, and secondly, priority. So on scope first, if I just go back to this question of diagnosis, what comes very, very clearly from all the diagnosis that environmental scientists have done over the years, and I see some in the audience here, is we have more, the challenge of net zero is not the only thing to worry about. At a higher level, we have climate, we have pollution, and we have biodiversity. Of these three, climate is the best understood. But I think to take an approach that just says it's the only thing to worry about in the environment is just too blinkered, and so therefore any program I think at the higher, we want to say national level, that's trying to deal with these problems of the environment has to recognise, I think, that breadth. Even if I go down into climate, mitigation is only half the problem. And I think it was a PermSec somewhere that was quoted to me as remarking that we own 3% of the mitigation problem and 100% of the adaptation problem. In other words, we can completely deal with our own mitigation problem. It doesn't mean that everything's sweetness and light. What it means is we still may have to deal full on with the adaptation problem unless those states that produce far more of the CO2 than we do something rather more dramatic than they have done today. So even within the climate barrier, it's really important not to just focus on net zero to the detriment of not worrying about how we deal with adaptation. It's obvious that at some point in the future these overlap. For example, if you come back to your land use questions, you end up, well, what do I need to plant now if I'm worrying about the climate in 50 years' time and so on. So with that, you know, that's sort of how we approach the scope problem. And so the theme that we're building, which we call Building a Green Future, does have that breadth, and it is prepared to acknowledge that first of all, there's that breadth in the environment, but they also they interact. And I think one or two of the speakers have already commented on that. I think certainly in earlier programs I've been involved in, like for example, the big plastics activity we did write explicitly the requirement that whatever you're going to do, you have to show that its impact on the environment is smaller than the problem you're trying to solve, because there's such a long history of technical approaches that solve one problem in the environment and immediately create another. So that's the sort of issues around scope. Now, the issues around priority, this is really tricky, of course, because everybody has their own priority. It's usually summarized by a two-letter word called me. On the other hand, you know, sort of difficult, the harder parts, although in some ways more interesting parts of the job I have is some level trying to call that, because however much money we have, it's not enough. And the second thing is about really trying to balance what I would describe choosing races but not winners. So how do you try and get that balance right? I guess what I'd say is on this that we have for more than a year now been discussing how we do that. It's worth saying that the UKI we already spend of the order of 800 million a year on activities whose primary beneficiary is the environment. They may not be understood that way, incidentally. Quite a lot of expenditure in industry, quite a lot of spend in engineering departments. But actually, if you look at first principles and say, well, why are you spending that? The answer is the beneficiary is the environment, not medicine, for example, not us. So 800 million is 10% of the entire UKI budget. So in some ways, we're not doing badly already. But almost all that expenditure is the way I describe it, the decision-making is asynchronous between 9 different partners. And even there are some good examples of councils moved together, and you mentioned hydrogen, and that's one of them, notably between EPSRC and Innovate. However, it's only at that level. That's the highest level at which there's any kind of integration. So 800 million is quite a lot, but nonetheless, the real test question is, okay, if you have your UKI program, what is it should be doing? What's its value add? How does it make its best contribution to these questions that we are looking at? So we eventually come to a conclusion about that. I'm going to outline 3 things. Every time I do this, everybody thinks that the first thing I say is the most important and the last thing I say is the least important. And it's impossible to get that right. You always get it wrong because you always guess the audience right. The order I'm going to say these things is nothing to do with the importance. It's everything to do with the degree to which we've prepared them. So the first thing I'm going to talk about, we have more preparation on. The last thing, which is actually the biggest in terms of money, we have least preparation on. So that's the reason for my order. Firstly, I think that we all recognize that actually there's an awful lot one knows the solution to today in order to achieve net zero. On the other hand, if you're really serious about that zero, then there's about 20% of the problems for which we don't have solutions today and which are really very tough challenges. Aeroplanes, just to give you an example. So it's very clear that there are some really difficult issues that really do require leading edge, front rank research in physics, in chemistry, in biology, if we're really going to reach the zero. And that's clearly a role for the research councils to fund. And we feel that there's, in priority terms alone, this is something that we should be giving priority to. The second issue related to that is it's not clear that only domestic expenditure is purely domestic is the right way to approach this, because because there's a lot of skills elsewhere. And what we're after is a shared solution of these problems. It's so fundamental, it doesn't really matter who comes to the answer. We all benefit. The second, I think, is second area we're looking at very much is the question of answering to what I describe as national priorities. Right. So, what is a national priority? This is a difficult question in Britain. Fascism, the last refuge of a scoundrel. It's all, as many of you may know, actually, it's the last refuge of a poor grant writer too, very often. And so, where do you go to get your sense of what is national priority? And our view about that is that there are bodies whose purpose is to tell us what the national priorities are, and those are indeed departments. And so we are energetically actually looking at a whole suite of partnership programs with, at the least, DEFRA, BEIS, Department of Transport and Health. They're in slightly different stages of planning. But that in those ways, we intend to identify national priorities and put on programs at some scale, because we can bring quite a lot of funding to bear on in comparison with what's normal on these national priorities. Mostly research strongly depends on whether you're talking about a domestic agenda or whether you're talking about an international one. In terms of research and development, often it veers strongly. I mean, if I say biodiversity is a very different question about in let's say Shropshire compared with Brazil, just to illustrate what I mean. We are, I think, at the UKI level, more or less decided we should focus on primarily the UK part of this, especially with the loss of GCRF funding, which otherwise in other circumstances could be brought to bear. And then the final area that is what we are referring to as accelerating the green economy. And this is essentially a shared program between the UKI budget and Innovate. Innovate had a very generous settlement, as you may have noticed. So pairing that up. And what we are focusing there on is this question: how do we bring together, in a geographical context, all of the partners that you need if you're going to accelerate growth in a regional sense? So that is, at a very least, that's the research base, that's the innovation base, that's the businesses, that's the local authorities, and indeed anybody else. The third sector to a degree, although that can get difficult, in order to try and address this question of how we bring the research and innovation base to bear on this other very difficult problem in the UK, which is the imbalance in growth across the country. And this, of course, will respond very directly, and it's a nice card to be able to play, given the new faces around Westminster and Whitehall right now. So I'm sorry if I ran my 8, probably I did. But anyway, I thought it'd just be useful to give you that quick sketch of where we were going with UKRI. But don't forget the 800 million, because that is still going to get rolled out in the way that it has in the past. So we are adding of the order of 10% of that budget in total. We are not, it's not a replacement, it is a genuine addition. So I'll stop there.
Good. To fulfill Ryan's ambition for this session, that we kind of pick up on some themes from the day. Liz and I in the break had a little chat about what we thought some of those themes might be. The first being that science is fundamental. You know, get a bunch of scientists in a room talking about something, of course they're going to say science is fundamental, but very much the focus being science of solutions. I don't think that's something we need to discuss on the panel. We thought that that was a theme coming through the day. The second, I think, quite interesting point that was made quite strongly both by Chris Stark and Patrick, and indeed some of the speakers on the stage with me now, was that the economic positives now outweigh the costs of net zero. However, we don't think that that's a universally held belief. I guess a question for the panel around that theme might be, what do our communities have to do to kind of get that message out a little bit more, so that you stop hearing on the news that the net zero is in the crosshairs because it's considered to be in the cost column rather than the savings column?
Yeah, so I'll start with that. I mean, again, it is about, you know, providing evidence, examples. Again, you provided examples on the panel of you know, exactly kind of when these, you know, the economic benefits, but also the other co-benefits. I mean, again, I think, Duncan, you mentioned this, you know, whether that's health benefits, personal economic benefits, biodiversity benefits. These are the things I think we just need to keep communicating, because there are multiple examples out there now of you know, certainly ways in which, you know, and again, it is about getting those messages out to different audiences. So conferences like this are great, but we're talking to peers who probably know most of these answers anyway. And so it's the challenge is getting out to those wider audiences, you know, putting scientists and, you know, solutioners out there to communicate, have the confidence to communicate about these things.
Looking at a couple of things that I think actually the current environment gives some opportunities on this front. I think it's the fact that this government is so focused on economic growth, and the fact that they really need to deliver on economic growth gives us the opportunities to make the argument that actually this sort of climate net zero tech area is one of those biggest opportunities for growth in the UK. And so I think it's a really good time to be able to make that argument and make that link more clearly to something the government really care about. And the other thing I was just saying on the more sort of micro scale, I think the thing we're seeing, as well as that sort of bigger economic argument, and we're seeing it become more of an imperative for individual businesses. I think that the current economic climate is clearly difficult for individuals, for businesses, and the cost of doing business is high, and particularly related to energy costs. So actually that drive for innovation, and I think we talked about earlier, the sort of energy efficiency side becomes more important. It's a bit easier to make that economic argument. Also on the other side, we're seeing it is around labour and talent retention, that the labour markets are so difficult at the moment in the UK that we were hearing from businesses that actually particularly among younger generations, working for an organisation where they can see the impact and they can see the purpose of what they're doing is increasingly important, and they're seeing making real impact in this area is something that helps them retain and attract staff. So I think it becomes an easier, almost in some ways, the difficult economic situation makes it an easier economic argument to make.
I just put in a plug for something. I totally agree with what Liz and Nicola said, and I think it's very important that it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in the fact that actually this is the place we're going. It's not as debatable. It's like, how do we maximise the value of that? The net zero strategy, which was published last year, before anyway, it was announced by the government recently that it's going to be reviewed by Chris Skidmore. Today, they've actually opened up an opportunity for people to put in evidence to support that. So I would just plug that actually, if you have evidence of this, it's very supportive, because the point of that review is to understand actually how can UK achieving net zero support growth and other government agenda. So actually, you know, this is a way direct line into that review and policy. So please do have a look at that and put information in if you've got it.
The third thing we saw as emerging from the day was really the importance of roadmaps and having clearer set of options in those roadmaps and reducing the number of options, because we are going to have to make some technology choices and recognise that those technologies themselves exist within broader systems. Does anyone on the panel want to maybe come to what their role in their institutions are in that clarification of options and that reduction of options? We've got a clearer set of roadmaps of where the UK might be heading.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try I'll attempt and answer that question, although you may find it's not terribly satisfactory. Because this question of roadmap is one that the Net Zero Innovation Bar that is a cross-government panel that I attend has discussed this question. And the thing to recognise, I think, is that this isn't just a technocratic problem. It's not just a problem of, you know, we've got this technical problem of reaching net zero. So, you know, could you just do a systems analysis, just to toss a word in, and you know, calculate all the options out and minimize this, maximize that, optimize that, and now you've got a roadmap that says, you know, maybe it has 3 or 4 options, and then depending on whether you want to optimize on cost or whatever, you know. The basic problem is that to achieve net zero requires choices, and of course, to come back to your earlier comment about, you know, we understand, some of us do. But the thing to recognise about the things that are impacting on the environment is that they're driven by consumption. Us, the same we, incidentally. So you want to blame climate change on oil companies, you need to recognise that when you go home and you want the fridge to work, you're compromised too. So this question of, the question of choice then becomes quite central to the achievement, and that's it. Individual choices as much as, for example, government policies. On the other hand, governments need to make choices. But at what point do we withdraw gas from domestic heating? Because as soon as we do it, it's going to be much more expensive to consume it. those are political choices, and by and large, in democratic systems, will by and large avoid them if they possibly can, especially in the elections. So what that means is really this question of the roadmap becomes really very difficult. And I think that in many ways, from the point of view of research, I think you've got to almost approach this as if you don't know what the roadmap is. And that means spread betting. So in other words, trying to invest significant funding in an array of solutions, because it's very, very difficult, particularly in terms of time, to know when alternatives when things will be. It's extraordinarily difficult to imagine a nation signing up to a particular path, and even if they did, another government could come along and change. I just think one needs to recognise the intrinsic difficulty of that. China is an organisation that can have a roadmap in a way that, yeah, I'm serious, in a way that in democratic systems is much harder.
Okay, I'm going to open up the floor now for questions for the panel and any reflections from the day. If we start up, a hand shot up there with the blue shirt towards the back.
Thanks, Clive Mitchell from Nature Scott. I think one of the themes that's come up through the day from remarks that Peter Bruce made onwards is the potential role of a circular economy to address the climate-nature crisis. Biogeochemicals cycles lie at the very heart of it. So I wondered if it'd be interesting to hear what the panel thinks from their own spheres of interest, how a circular economy, how important that is in terms of transitioning to net zero and managing climate risks.
Any examples?
I'm not sure they have examples. It is something that came up, I think, in our discussion with businesses, and we're actually having a roundtable on this in a few weeks' time, bringing businesses together to share examples between businesses around their challenges and how they're overcoming them when they're looking to sort of develop circular economy business models. I think there are some businesses that are looking to do it well, but I think it comes back to that systems problem, that it's really it's quite a challenge. So I'm not sure that I have answers. I think it is cool. I think it's something we've seen a lot of interest in. So holding a series of events with different businesses, and it's probably the one that until now we've seen most interest in, which I think is really interesting. I think people are thinking about it, but struggling to know how to do it as an individual organisation, I think.
I guess my reply, firstly, if one's looking slightly wider than just the net zero question, it's very clear that circular economy has there are a lot of things that benefit if you were to circularize rather than continue to dig stuff out the ground. Plastic, I'll just mention plastic as immediate, for instance. If we do talk about net zero, then this question of where the critical minerals come from and how do you dodge the fact that the people who've got them may not really, it may be too, there's a security issue around it. So circularizing, for example, rare earths. I think though, and indeed EPSSD have a significant program, and so it is clearly important. I'm not quite sure it's so actually important for net zero per se, although obviously anything that can be done to make things more efficient energy-wise is desirable. So that's like my very quick answer to that. It's clearly, in the end, as circularizing our consumption of material has to be the long-term outcome. The other thing I say, I wouldn't underestimate the difficulty, depending on what it is you choose, as well as recognizing that if you are circularizing, your basic problem is to produce a circularized food stock, which is of the same quality and price as coming out of the ground. That's a real, and that is a big challenge, and why this is why there's a lot of research needed to do in any given material to reach that happy point where you cross over.
I think there's probably an important resilience point there, is the fact that when we get to net zero, it needs to be a resilient net zero that we can achieve in perpetuity from there on in. It's not just a single point in time. So actually, you know, there are immediate challenges for getting there, and then there are long-term challenges to how we continue to achieve net zero in an efficient and effective way.
Good. A few more questions. So go blue shirt and then two down.
Hi, John Broderick from the Royal Society of Chemistry. Just leading on from that, I wonder if you had any further reflections on the role of scientists, science-intensive organisations in managing their own environmental impacts. as to whether that is important from a leadership position, whether that is a minor interest when we consider the kind of the national carbon footprint as a whole. Just wonder from your own perspectives where you saw the priority for actions in that area.
Yeah, and I think as a learned society, professional body, we have a real role to play here, both as an organisation ourselves, but also support to our members. And I know, we've done work together looking at kind of surveying our members to look at, how we can support them on this journey. I think this is really important, as I say, as professional and learned bodies. I think that's a real role to say. I mentioned that at the beginning, that leadership role. We don't know all the answers, but we know a lot of them and many of them. And together, collectively, as I say, through Science Council, I think there's a real kind of strength in how we can take that forward, definitely.
I was smiling when you asked that question, and the reason I was smiling was because about 18 months ago I took a policy paper to the UKI board, which we agreed a 2040 target, and I now have the problem of figuring out how we might deliver on it, which I could talk to a little bit. But let me come to the heart of your question, I think, which is the question of is it important reputationally? The papers are full of scientists telling people what to do all the time. All the time they're saying we've got to do this for climate, we've got to do that, we've got to do the other. It's interesting that quite a lot of that rhetoric isn't scientific, I must say. But nonetheless, the papers are full of scientists saying that. And I personally think that it's almost impossible situation if scientists elsewhere are saying we're special and we can't apply, we're so special we must apply those rules to ourselves. I don't think it works. So I think it's absolutely important that the scientific and wider, actually the research community generally recognises that we need to work to move to make our own activities net zero. And you could either see that as a leadership position, or I would say just an ordinary moral position. Otherwise, you end up in a really difficult position for democracy. How difficult is that? Well, it's very strongly dependent on this, because the UKI, just to give you some idea, consumes about twice as much energy itself as the largest university in the country, just to give you some idea. So if we argue this for the sector, we've got to argue it for ourselves. On the other hand, we are trying to argue this for the sector, and if we hadn't had a rail strike next week, I would have hosted a dinner of VCs to discuss with them starting a concordat to try and see how we could nationally arrive at, because technically the funded activities, the activities we fund are scope 3. So we have to worry about it in that sense. So just in summary, I think it's just tremendously important that we address the question and live with the consequences. I mean, the third biggest use of energy in UKI is ship fuel oil. It's in NERC. But we got to figure out how to explore the oceans, and there's zero. And that's a big challenge. It's a tremendously interesting one. I could bore you with that something. Nonetheless, I believe quite fundamentally, we've got to get our own house in order, like everybody else.
If we take a couple of questions, we'll take one over here, and the gentleman in the purple jumper at the back there. So Bruce, if you head down to him.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Metzger. I also work for the Royal Society of Chemistry. I think that one of the themes I heard throughout the day quite a bit was the use of the word translation. And I hear this not only here, but in other conversations with other people in our sort of areas, that we need to be translating the science to the policymakers or to whoever is making the decision makers. Is there any advice you can give for scientists who are working on their translation skills, you might say, to help better craft their messages in a way that is understandable, that is impactful, especially when perhaps they're used to speaking to an audience of peers who already know all their jargon and stuff and don't get exposed to those other audiences very often?
We'll take this question as well.
Thank you. Noel Nelson, Met Office. I think this follows on a little bit from that last question, in that the translation of science, but for the public. I think that one of the problems with global problems such as air quality or climate change is that the public at large feel that they feel overwhelmed by the problem, and they don't understand some of the science, and as a result they see this as something that the government needs to develop solutions for, rather than them being involved in helping to develop the solution in partnership with the government. So it's quite good to hear Liz bring up the point about using science as an empowerment tool. So my question really was that, yes, we can impart the knowledge, but that in itself isn't enough. How does one, what are the other steps involved in empowering the public at large to be more involved with working with alongside government on this?
Yeah, I'm happy to cover both of those really. And again, I guess an example where we've, you know, again, as a science body, communicating with much wider audiences, the general public, you know, working with social scientists certainly helps. But we did a joint communique with many of the societies within the Science Council just before, I'm trying to think how many years ago it was now, probably about 4 years ago. And we pulled in organisations from outside science, so arts, humanities, much wider audiences. And it was really interesting to see how this one-page communique went from being a science document, a briefing paper, to a much more powerful communication paper, because the language changed as you worked with different audiences who, you know, to me, I understand what 1.5 degree warming, global average warming is, but to your average person on the street, they haven't got a clue what that means. And, you know, it really does help if you can bring a diverse audience together to draft the communication and to deliver that communication. So, you know, we will pull in people who work in arts and music and drama to try and communicate that to their audiences, because a scientist will find that very difficult to get those messages out. And I think, Noel, I think for empowerment, for me, it's not just communicating the science, it's not just giving the evidence and the facts, it's actually giving them some call to action, I guess, something that they can physically do. And, you know, quite often it's their voice that is the strongest thing, whether that's a voice making a vote for a change, whether it's making a personal statement or having those conversations. And we do a lot of work with schools, and an argument people will say to me is, but that generation is, you know, by the time they get into the system and can make decisions, you know, it's going to be too late. But actually, no, they go home from school and they have that conversation with their parents and their grandparents, and they have that conversation with people around them. And that is going to make those changes, you know, in much quicker time than waiting for them to grow up and move into that generation. But I think you're right, Doug. If we just give them facts, they'll either go away too anxious, it's too big a problem, I can't do anything about it, or there's a bit of apathy kind of that comes in. It's about giving them, you know, actual action, call to action, solutions, things that they can, you know, actually make a difference going forward.
I guess, I mean, the other thing I would say, yeah, to support what Liz says totally, is actually a really positive message about what people can do. And I think the other thing I support is the fact that really important need to make it easy for people to do things. I think we sort of forget that actually, you know, a lot of the gains we made around, you know, things like actually making appliances more energy efficient and things like that, providing people information, removing the cost penalty from actually taking green choices and making it easy so that, you know, it's a natural right thing to do rather than something you have to feel like you're wearing a hair shirt to actually do. I think in terms of policy and politicians and things like that, I'm always surprised by how many politicians say that actually their view on climate change and things like that are being influenced by their partner, by their children and things like that. So actually, you know, let's get to the families as much as anything else. It's a really important route for actually changing people's minds and things like that. We can provide all the evidence and things like that, but also making it real and personal and people understanding it is important. But if you do want to change policy as well, you know, a lot of it is based on costs and, you know, analysis, and there are cost benefits, and you know, there's a whole process of policies that need to be analysed. So making sure that we have the right evidence, particularly of the benefits and the costs and things like that, to feed into those analysis to make those policies really appealing is important, because ultimately a lot of it is around, you know, will Treasury fund it? What's the payback time for these kind of things? You know, that's how it works. So actually having that information support, that's really important.
So I'm not really qualified to answer this question because I've never been a CSA, but I have talked to a number. And indeed, actually, Chris Whitty was our councilman the other day, and he was talking exactly to this question. And he's got a long experience of it because he's been doing it for quite a long time now, and he was doing it in DFID before he did it in health. He first of all observed that you've got to recognise that there are many issues where it's unlikely that science will actually be listened to. I could any number of examples of this, but let's just talk about, let's just pick up on badgers and bovine TB, because Scientifically, it's pretty clear what you need to do. So in other words, the issues that are really determining the policy outcome are political forces in the of various groups in the country, and that's what's going to dominate the outcome. And to some extent, you're just wasting your time if you think a detailed scientific argument's going to work. In other words, the flip side of that is choose your target, because there are other occasions where science really can be effective if you've got all your ducks lined up. And so that's one observation you made. Second was be very patient. You know, you can wait for years actually, and then suddenly there'll be an opportunity to persuade a minister who they turn over very rapidly. Bear in mind, yeah, it's serious. And suddenly you'll get an opportunity. So the second is to be aware that there's often a very short window, and then you get done the thing that you actually wanted to do. And the third thing, I guess he says, is you've got to speak in their language. Now, whether that's translation or not, I'm not sure, but it's in my view, it's more about empathy. In other words, recognizing how they're going to see the world rather than how you think it should be. So that would have, I'm giving you, what's the phrase? I'm channeling my inner Chris Whitty. Someone said to me the other day, I don't really know what it means. Fowler used to say that metaphors should be accurate. Nonetheless, that's what I'm doing. I'm probably not doing it very well, but those are the themes that he talked about when we went exactly to your question just last week.
You need to go next slide, please.
Yeah.
So we've only got time for one more question. One over here.
Hi, I'm Philip Martinelli. Just wanted to ask a similar question along a similar vein, but related to business. Nicola, you mentioned the Be More Green guidance. Duncan, you mentioned the VC community. There's things like ESGVC. I think on an earlier panel, people talked about SBTI standards. There's so much guidance out there for businesses coming from a lot of different directions. How do we as scientists sort of work together and make sure that the best recommendations are coming forward and the most actionable ones, rather than a lot of different guidance from a lot of different directions that becomes too much noise for people to be able to act upon?
Good question. And I think, I would say that I don't think kind of multiple lots of guidance from different places is always negative. I think particularly because the business community as a whole is so broad, and actually if you're GSK or Rolls-Royce or a local kind of corner shop, you're going to need very different advice and very different guidance on what decarbonising looks like. So I think it can be helpful to have sort of different approaches that are going to work for different businesses. And I think also within large businesses, again, there's so many different levels where people are playing different roles, and actually the advice and the guidance that you need to make the case to a board to make an investment, where you might be looking at standards, might be looking at regulation, is quite different to the sort of guidance you might be empowering sustainability professionals within that business on what they can practically do at their level and how they can influence upwards. So I don't necessarily think the kind of plethora is necessarily bad, but I think probably organisations like ourselves and others can play a role in signposting and help directing people to sort of useful things. I would say that I think big organisational things. So I think science-based targets has had a huge reach into the business community. I think that's quite well understood, and there's a lot of recognition of that. So I think there is a lot of recognition of scientifically based sort of validated guidance. Yes, I think there's a good range of things out there, and that range can be helpful in some ways.
Are there any insights from the department? So the question was about how the science community kind of interacts and with policymakers and prevents there being too many voices that kind of confuse.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one because obviously there is a broad diversity of views, and it's important to reflect that. But I think, sort of, organisations like CBI and others can do a really important and powerful role in pulling that together to provide, a coherent thing, and also a mechanism for dialogue as well. I think, actually sometimes we forget that, the scientists will provide a message and then it will take them forward. But actually, it should be very much more about a dialogue in terms of then questions and understanding, and explaining why certain things might not happen, and coming back and having that dialogue rather than just one way. So I think that there is really important role for organisations to play in doing that.
If I understood correctly, the question that was voiced in business, if I understood correctly.
Yeah, I guess how can scientists and policymakers?
So I guess my answer to that question is, this is, in my view, this is quite question dependent. So just to illustrate what I mean by that, for example, let's take a problem like how do you put climate risk on a private sector bank balance, private sector account? We think that problem is that there's sufficient understanding and data about what the problem is, that the crucial part of that is transferring that understanding to a private sector balance sheet. And so what we've done there is we've funded an activity which is precisely designed to try and bring the parties together to figure out that joint problem. Let me give you another one. Biodiversity net gain, which is now appearing in the legislation in the UK. That isn't ready. I've spoken to a number of businesses around that who want a solution, but actually there isn't even a reasonable, half-working, useful definition of what biodiversity is, never mind what the net gain on it is. And so in that case, what we've done is put money into just so could we figure out at least some sort of pragmatic set of things that one could then bring, as it were, business along the answers. So I actually think it's quite nuanced, and I certainly don't think it's one size fits all.
This has been the last plenary of the day. It's mandatory for us to each summarise a take home. So no more than 30 seconds each. What would your take home for the attendees be?
That's a good question. I guess it goes back to, I mean, again, the kind of message I always kind of leave on is, you know, we understand the problem. And I think we've seen today that many of those solutions, we don't have every solution, but there's many solutions out there. It's really about taking action now. So away we go.
I'd say maybe for me, the kind of partnership angle, I think that came up a lot in discussions earlier around the role that, you know, where we can collaborate and sort of not duplicate resource between institutions, but also sort of bring different perspectives and expertise from our different disciplines and perspectives.
Yeah, I think the thing for me is sort of the diversity of where action needs to be taken, and I think where science can play a role. So, we talked about the public and public information. We've talked about government and policy. We've talked about business. There's finance. There's the international sphere as well. So actually, we need to target all those audience and make sure there's progress in all those areas. But I think it's really positive that actually all those areas are already there and they are listening. And so the first step's done, I think, but we just need to continue to make the voice of science heard and make sure that it is informing that action.
So I guess my answer to that question is achieving net zero is a very difficult thing to do. And one should not underestimate that there are forces out there which would prefer it doesn't happen. And it's not difficult to identify them, and it's not difficult to recognize that they have clout. And that's true both nationally, but it's even more true internationally. So because of that, I think it becomes very important to stay completely positive and actually, in a slightly religious sense, go on believing this is possible, because I think it's really important that the community that could make it work go on believing that, because you could get out of bed and say this is almost too difficult. So recognize the difficulty, but stay positive, and it's belief that's going to get us there, is what I would say.
Okay, I'd like to thank all my fellow panelists for what was a very informative session, and thank all the Science Council staff for what's been a wonderful day. I'm just going to pass over to Carol for the last closing remarks. Thank you.
So I would just like to make some closing remarks. And one of the things I learned when I was a chief scientific advisor in Whitehall was only ever make 3 points, and then everybody will remember them. I'm a scientist, and the problem facing us as a community is so large, I'm going to double that and make 6 points that you can group them. I also like alliteration, and so I've been thinking about capacity and co-creation, but actually I centered finally on the letter S. And the 6 S's that stand out for me from today are science, scale, and systems, supply chains, solutions, and society. And I'm sure that doesn't encompass everything that our speakers have spoken about today, but I love the idea of the pragmatic optimism. And I agree with Duncan. If any of you have seen the film Don't Look Up, do watch it. I am an astrophysicist. I watched it with my teeth clenched. I wept, I screamed, and at the end I went, oh my goodness me, it's impossible, but it has to be possible. There is no alternative, right? There is no choice. And we have to drive that, and we have to drive it pragmatically. And we can see, I think, from our wonderful panelists this afternoon and all of the discussions that we've had, is that we need to believe in that because the solutions are there 80% and we need to drive the progress. And Duncan, I think you made this point, you know, sort of reflecting on Chris Whitty's comments. And I've said this to my scientific colleagues before, and they come to me and they say, you're a CSA, do something. And they scream about their science bit and they're incredibly passionate. And I say, okay, if I could get you 5 minutes in front of a minister now, what would you ask them to do? And they go, oh, but my science and my science. What would you ask them to do? Because that's the pace that the ministers are working at and probably ever faster. What is it you want me to do? And they have communities in their ears all the time. So I think keeping that in the back of our mind, if we had that minute to say, do this now, what would it be? And then how would we back that up with the evidence base? So I think today, I hope, is a start to the building of our community to do that. Sometimes it can be incredibly lonely when you are in your discipline or you are in your institution or you are in a family or a community where maybe people don't even know what climate science is. I don't do science. It's not something I was good at school. So we have had, I think, a positive discussion because we're in some ways, a nice bubble. And what we need to do is keep those connections, grow them. The science community, the Science Council offers that as a service to you. We are a convening point. We are a connection point, and we can help those collaborations, work with and beyond your professional societies, reach out to us individually if we can help, and we will continue to develop these policy forums with that very active, action-based approach. So I hope you found good connections today. I hope we can continue to build on them. And today would not have happened without immense work from the teams behind the scenes. And you know, when you come to an event and everything works smoothly and you don't have to think about it because the systems have worked, you know that then there's been disproportionate amount of work in the background. You've seen some of my colleagues up here chairing and speaking to you today, but behind the scenes, I particularly like to thank the Institute of Physics and their team for hosting us here today. I also like to thank my team at the Science Council. We've been working on this now for nearly a year, specifically, but more in concept longer than that, and particularly Ryan Mercer, Liz Gill, Ruth Herbert and Jane Banks for all of their behind the scenes work that have just made everything so smooth, and also the comms that have been happening leading up to and after this. Do tweet. Of course, all of the member organisations who've contributed today, because we would not have had this programme, we wouldn't have had these wonderful speakers and these incredible discussions. These didn't happen by accident. We didn't just pitch up and decide how to discuss things. All of those societies came together to decide how to really design these in a strategic way. So thank you to our societies. My penultimate one, of course, is all of the speakers that have spoken today, whether they're still in the room or not, or whether they've gone home. Thank you to them because they really made the day. Last but certainly not least, all of you for coming. Anybody who's still with us online, safe journey, and we'll be in touch with follow-up. Thank you very much.